Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical, as always. Today I am immediately joined by Bess Goden, the creator of the Millennial Splaining program on YouTube. And hopefully we will soon be joined by Renee Johnston, longtime friend of the show. In the meantime, how are you doing, Bess? How's your week been?
Thank you. I'm doing all right. My week has been definitely a busy one. I've been chatting a lot with different people, different Palestinians, frankly, internationally. I've been able to contact Khalil, who lives in Gaza, and he has been going through a very difficult time. The last time I spoke with him, there was a bomb in the background of our conversation. And then later, I texted him to check in to make sure he was all right. And he said, "You remember the bombing sound?" And I said, "Yes." And then he sent me a picture of like one building, and then the rest of it was rubble. And he was like, "This is what happened." So, I mean, that my week has been a lot of seriousness. Unfortunately, there's a lot of ugliness in the world right now, and it's
There, there
really,
really is, and
it's
people
really,
really need to know what's happening.
yeah, absolutely. Like usually I'm the kind of person that can make a joke out of anything, but at this point, there's nothing to laugh about. It's just it's very disgusting.
Well,
So
I mean, there are some things that are absurd that will lend themselves to jokes in the future, but it's just a little too fresh right now.
right, absolutely.
There's a lot of absurdity going on, though. I mean, it's really important to understand how ridiculous some of this really is. If
Absolutely.
you
On the propaganda side,
well,
100.
well, if you look at the way that the IDF appears to take these ideas that would be totally anti-Semitic if someone said them about Jewish people,
Yeah.
and then apply them to Palestinians as if we don't know what they're doing. We've never seen this before.
Yeah.
I
Uh,
mean,
I said on one of my streams this week that I think that some of us survivors or descendants of Holocaust survivors learned cruelty from the Holocaust and not, anything else, not helping the little guy, not.
well, the the thing you have to remember, the thing you have to remember is that the founders of the revisionist Zionist movement started out in the 1920s, even before the Holocaust,
Hmm.
and were sending settlers to Palestine before the Holocaust for a period of some 20 years almost, both legally and illegally. During important parts of this period, they had very close cooperation with the very right-wing parties in the Second Polish Republic
Hmm.
and the government of Nazi Germany. The Second Polish Republic helped about 100,000 Jews emigrate to Palestine between 1920 something and 1939 when the war started.
Wow.
And the Nazi German government and the German Zionist Union cooperated to send 60,000 German Jews to Palestine between 1933, when the Nazis took power,
Mhm.
and 1939, when the war started, and Hitler was no longer focused on foreign policy that wasn't based on the war effort.
Oh my God.
So you have people who are descended from people who went to Palestine and skipped the Holocaust, whose view towards Holocaust survivors is not necessarily positive or one of solidarity.
Interesting.
And many of these folks are the leaders of political Zionism, the people who blew up the King David Hotel, the people who blew up Palestinian houses even before the war started in 1947.
Wow. Hey, Renee, I don't want to sit
Welcome, Renee.
here.
Hey, good morning. Sorry.
Nothing to be sorry about. That's one of the benefits of having more than one person is you can start talking and then work somebody else in. How are you doing today?
I'm okay. It's life. Just trying to get through the myriad of things that have to be done in one day, and I'm one person, so yeah.
Well, thank you for including us. We appreciate it.
I'm glad to be here. How you guys doing?
Good. Thank you for including me. It's been a while, and I'm so happy to be here.
Yes,
Good.
our pleasure. I'm doing reasonably well. I've been, trying not to be too traumatized by everything happening in Palestine, while at the same time trying to find the humor in in Dr. Cornel West's shock and amazement that Dr. Jill Stein is running for president.
Yeah,
I see you're finding the humor as well, so that's good.
I don't really understand why she's decided to do it. I said somewhere else, like
No, you see, you have to understand. This was inevitable, and I'm going to tell you why it was inevitable. It has to do with Green Party national strategy. And the whole Green Party national strategy is built on getting 5% in a presidential election so that they can get federal money for all the other elections around the country. That's the one complaint that I have about the Green Party, is that everything is invested into this presidential elections project,
right.
And not enough goes anywhere else. And now the thing you have to remember is you cannot get 5% in a national presidential election if your party does not run a candidate.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So the moment that Cornel West said he wasn't running as a Green, the Green Party hinted that this was going to happen. The Green Party said they would be running a primary and running candidates.
Well, I mean, there's a primary without her.
Yes. Oh, definitely. Now we could have a whole other argument about why Jill Stein should or shouldn't run for president.
Right.
There's
That's
a
what I
great
was
argument there.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about.
Okay. Yeah. No, I'm still on Cornel West seeming so shocked that the Greens would be running someone.
Yeah, I'm not shocked that, because that's, as you said,
you
that's
also
part
have
of
to
their
figure,
plan.
If Cornel West is the candidate for the Green Party, I mean, as an independent, not the candidate for the Green Party, runs as an independent, then now there's pressure on the Greens to run the biggest names they can find in order to share at least some independent media space with Dr. West. So, the biggest names they can find are Jill Stein and Howie Hawkins right now. And there's a plethora of reasons why some people in the Green Party don't want it to be Howie, and some signs that Howie doesn't really want to run again anyway.
Yeah, I think he's been pretty open that that's not really what he wants to do again.
And so, I mean, so you've got to have somebody who thinks they're one of the big celebrities who can compete with Dr. West for airtime. And I mean, Chris Hedges isn't going to run against Cornel West. He was involved in all sorts of cheerleading for him to run in the first place. So that leaves Jill Stein. I mean, as far as the people who have any sort of name recognition with the same people Dr. West has name recognition with.
It's all just such wasted energy.
Oh, of course. No, I mean, I'm on the record repeatedly saying that elections are relatively irrelevant and that we should be focused on revolutionary action.
Yeah.
Most specifically, divesting from the capitalist system and building our own system for mutual aid and local economy and self-defense.
Yeah.
But that said, electoral politics are what people are going to talk about, at least to some degree, because people are really excited
I think it's
about
a clout.
elections.
I think it's also a clout thing. I think that it's very easy to get views on a video that says it's about Jill Stein, rather than a video that's about mutual aid, unfortunately. But and I'm not here to crap on anyone talking to Jill Stein or any presidential candidate. I think it's important. Uh, I think it's
I
important.
would talk to Jill Stein. I would talk to Cornel West. In fact,
Absolutely. But I think that that's, why people sort of feature the presidential run. It's an easy topic, to sort of grab on.
well, the thing is if I were going to start talking too much about the presidential run all the time, then I would mention, and I'll go ahead and mention it now. I've alluded to it on Twitter, but I haven't said it on the show, so I might as well say it on the show. I sent a media contact on the Cornel West website very early asking about whether you'd like to come on the show and talk about education and COVID policy. And what I got was added to his campaign mailing list to solicit donations.
Right. He's not coming on to talk to you. Well, you know what? Let me not say I don't work for him. So let me not say it 100%. He's unlikely to come on to talk to you about either of those things because they're points of contention where you're going to ask him questions he's not comfortable answering.
Well, and I get that too. And, I can understand why he probably wouldn't come on the show to talk about that stuff.
Yeah.
I'd also love to talk to him about freedom of speech at college campuses right now.
Mm-hmm.
Because some of his past positions on the question are worth talking about.
Right.
Right.
And Bess, I don't know if you had a chance either. So, one of the things when I do the Saturdays, I've gotten into this habit of bringing spreadsheets.
Oh.
And so the latest spreadsheet is me digging into these university research centers.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so they market when the government says we have these university affiliated research centers, they say there's 17 of them,
mm-hmm.
which is technically true. Like the programs they call university affiliated research centers there's 17 of those. Mm-hmm. However, they fail to mention how many other affiliations the other research centers have with colleges and universities. They fail to mention these membership affiliation groups that have, there had to be 40 or 50 colleges and universities on that list.
The thing you got to remember is there's always the official college and university research groups. And then there's all the corporate college and corporate research groups that are affiliated in unofficial ways with colleges and universities.
Right. But I'm talking about the DOD ones.
Oh, yeah.
And the Department of Energy ones.
Mm.
And the Army and the Air Force. And I was, and I expected it, and I was still surprised at how many existed.
One of my favorite 80s comedies, Real Genius, is about this very topic. It is about genius college students doing all the work for their professor, William Atherton, who always plays assholes in 80s comedies. He's the guy who played Peck on Ghostbusters. William Atherton is their professor, and he's basically doing what is contract work for the people designing Star Wars. Only instead of blowing up a missile from space, it's assassinating some asshole the U.S. doesn't like from space. So he's got his college students working on this project for him, doing all the work, while he runs around doing asshole college professor with tenure stuff. And this is not the reason that this movie was made, even though it's a comedy, is because it is not too far removed from what colleges were doing with government contractors in the 1980s.
Right.
And they're still doing it now, I'm sure.
I'm sure.
So that's always a good topic. So then my question is what are our presidential candidates' positions on this?
My
all of them.
My question on this would be: you cannot kill one person from space. If you cannot kill one person from a drone from 100 feet up in the air, you cannot kill one specific person. Hit civilians. Then you sure as hell target one person from space.
The science fiction-y aspect of this is that it's not a missile or a rocket or anything like that. It's a laser.
Oh, okay.
And they're specifically working on the part of making the laser work. And at one point, the one kid asks the other kid, who's Val Kilmer.
Okay.
It's like one of Val Kilmer's first movies. He's really young.
Yeah, I remember seeing the poster for it, I think.
Yes. Surf Nicaragua on the T-shirt. That's the one that's the T-shirt on the poster, the Val Kilmer in the Surf Nicaragua. You've never seen this movie, Renee?
No.
You're my age. How can you not see this movie? This is like, well, I mean, okay, there are cultural differences.
Yeah, I was going to say, one, I'm older than you.
By a year. That's close enough.
Yeah, I'm trying to. I was actually never a Val Kilmer fan.
So this is the era of Ghostbusters and Revenge of the Nerds and Karate Kid and those kinds of 80s.
Right.
This is the movie. This is one of the two movies, and I'm just going to go ahead and be a creepy nerd for a moment here and not worry about it. This is the movie that has my favorite 80s actress who I totally had a crush on as a kid, Michelle Mayerink. She's in two movies. She's in Real Genius and she's in Revenge of the Nerds. If you've seen Revenge of the Nerds, she plays Anthony Edwards' girlfriend, Jenny.
Okay. Yes.
She looks totally different in Real Genius, but it's the same actress, and you can tell from her unique voice and speaking patterns, which are just so awesome. I love how quirky and weird she is.
Wait, from the first one or the second one? The blonde from the first one, the second one?
She's not. No. The blonde in Revenge of the Nerds is in the first one was Julia Montgomery.
Oh, okay.
Julie Montgomery played Betty Childs. She is that is the mandatory 80s college comedy character falls in love with her rapist storyline.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I actually never saw that until I think several months ago, to be honest. Not even a full year ago.
It's one of those things that was,
and I was like,
it's one of those movies. It's one of those movies that everybody at the time was like, oh, this is normal. And you think about it now and it's like, oh my God, we were horrible people.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what I'm like? Okay. Can I just say
Rocky is the same way, because if you really look too closely at Rocky, it's totally racist.
People who were saying at the time, this is horrible, except they weren't given the microphone. You know what I'm saying?
So you might be right.
Back to a time where everybody thought it was okay. Just remember who everybody really was. You know, no offense.
No, and that's fair.
Like my mother was a very big feminist. Okay.
Well, what I am saying, what I'm saying is that I know lots of people who have consumed this content themselves during the 80s, and they look at it now and it's like, how could we have ever watched this?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I absolutely look back at some of the stuff I saw in the 90s and go, oh my God, how could I have been okay with it? Maybe even up to like 2013. I love this one cartoon, Gravity Falls, but there are some cringy shit in there. Like,
well, yeah.
In 2013, and that was 5 minutes ago.
Yes. I mean, there's the cringy. I mean, if you look at the 80s sports movies, the 80s sports movies are all so cringy.
Oh yes.
One of the terrible facts of the Karate Kid is that the only black person with a speaking role is one of the Cobra Kais. So one of the bad guys is the only black person.
Right.
There's also a referee who's black at the very end. But he was the actual referee and not an actor. So it was like we use scenes from the tournament because we use scenes from the real tournament. We're going to have the real referee be the referee.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, Connor's in the chat talking about The Last Dragon.
Yes. Now you see, The Last Dragon. The Last Dragon is definitely much better on race than most 80s martial arts movies. It's true. The Last Dragon is probably the best blaxploitation movie ever made. I have to admit.
I am fully here for it. Fully here for it.
I mean, you know, and the fun part is that the kid in The Last Dragon, even though he did not make many movies or have a long career, was like the last person, and he was like 15 or 16 when he did this. But he was the last person to beat Chuck Norris in Chuck Norris's competitive career before he retired and went straight movie star.
Whoa.
Really?
Yes, and he was just like a kid when he did it, like 14 or 15.
Ah.
Good.
I just know he was fine. That's it. That's all I know. That's it. I was here. I was there for it. I will still say,
you know, I have to admit,
it is still one of my all-time.
Vanity is the leading lady in that movie, and I have to admit I really enjoyed Vanity as a kid, so I understand what you mean.
All right, I'm gonna go make coffee. I'm here, but I'm gonna go off camera so you all don't see me like moving around like a crazy person. But I'm here.
That's fine. But yeah, no, it's just the other, and it cuts back to 80s. It's a 90s movie, but it cuts back to 80s sports movies because the star is Carl Weathers. The other Vanity movie, of course, is Action Jackson, which is the only cop movie where only cop movie I know of where the cop goes after the real bad guys in society, a rich white auto executive.
Oh, okay, refreshing.
And he's now the bad side is the hero is a guy who's got so many brutality charges on his record that he's not allowed to carry a gun anymore. So it's not a perfect movie, but it really does buy into that sort of thing that was going on in the 80s for a while, where they lionized the brutal cop in a way that wasn't cool.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's the only cop movie I've ever seen where the bad guy is a white auto executive. And you know that's worthy of notice.
Yeah.
But Vanity is in that one too. And I
don't know too many people who weren't Vanity fans, to be honest. So I feel like you're not alone in that. And it's probably okay. And I'll be honest, there's probably a few people who are going to watch this at some point in time, and you're going to go up like 2 ticks on their like ladder. Simply for 1, knowing who Vanity is, and for 2, admitting that you also indeed had a crush on her, like every other person that I knew growing up, which is hysterical. Okay.
Well, no, my big crushes growing up were Vanity, Janice Jackson, and I cry whenever I think about her now, and Dana Plato. And Dana Plato got stuck in that whole child actor thing in the 80s that Corey Feldman talks about, and that fucked up him and Corey Haim so much and didn't survive.
Oh. That's awful.
She was the sister from Different Strokes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
She got arrested for an armed robbery, and after getting out, ended up committing suicide. Very depressing.
Yeah, that's awful.
Well, it was so there are three different portions. There are three different stories to Different Strokes, two of which are good and one of which is horrific.
Okay.
The good stories, the first good story is that the network wanted Conrad Bain to make a TV show, and it was up to him what TV show he could make. And this is the one we got because that's the kind of person he was. So that's the first good story. It was up to Conrad Bain what TV show he wanted to make, and Different Strokes is the show he wanted to make.
Okay.
Because the only thing that they knew of, the only thing they knew before going in was that they were going to do a show with Conrad Bain and Gary Coleman because that would be funny.
Okay.
And it was up to Conrad Bain what the show was going to be, and he said, "I want to be Gary Coleman's dad."
Okay.
And that was, and so everything was written around how to make Conrad Bain Gary Coleman's dad. And then the second great story is that the only good person that any of these kids had in their life was apparently Conrad Bain. But then the bad story is that the kids on Different Strokes all ended up totally fucked over by their parents and their agents and the people close to their parents and agents who were abusing them in return for making them stars. It's really, if you want to talk about Me Too stuff, the kids on Different Strokes were
totally abused. Yeah.
Really, really, really terribly worked over. Not just abused on a personal level by people in their families and people close to their families or their agents, but also by the Hollywood system in a really harsh, heartless, total lack of concern for what was happening to the kids as long as Hollywood was making money from them.
That's awful. That's really awful. You know, it's, the entertainment industry is extremely exploitive to begin with, but then there's like a whole other layer when it's the kids, right? Because they have so many people that are quote unquote.
But this is the thing. That layer of exploitation isn't even. Sorry, I don't mean to talk over you. I got upset because it's not even just the kids.
Yeah.
Brendan Fraser was blacklisted for years because he got mad because someone grabbed his ass on set.
Really? Is that why?
Yes.
I never knew that story. That's completely fucked up.
So it's not even just the kids.
Yeah,
or even just the so-called vulnerable women. It's everybody.
It's everybody. Absolutely.
And what you don't, and when you really think about that, anybody is vulnerable. Brendan Fraser was a leading man who had made people a fortune on the Mummy franchise. And it actually, I'll be honest, I didn't think much of Brendan Fraser before the first Mummy movie. And when I saw the first Mummy movie, I was like, wow, he's amazing. How could I have not known he was this good before? And so he was like at the very peak of his success when he was blacklisted too. So It's all very.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I have no idea.
It shows that it can happen to any worker. Absolutely. If it can happen to someone at the very, very elite level of Hollywood, at the pinnacle of his success, it can happen to any worker.
Absolutely. I grew up actually doing theater, and the attitude, and I don't know if it's partially because, when I was a kid, they were also like treating us like it was a day camp, and they felt like they had to like sort of herd children into, from chaos to order. But it's very much like stand here and cry, stand here, bend over and show your ass to the audience. Like these things were normal, right? Like you weren't,
Well,
Like
I mean,
it's like
so
you were used like a meat puppet, essentially.
well, I mean, to
And
a
there was
uh,
literally one time. Wait, well, let me tell
yes,
this
please.
real quick. There was literally one time I was told in a prestigious, uh, in a prestigious setting, right? Like people had to audition to get into this program, and I was in it. And we were told by one of the directors that if we didn't enunciate properly, he would stick his hand up our asses and make us talk like we were Muppets. And we were children.
Now,
What I'm saying,
so
that kind of attitude is normal.
well,
You are used to being treated like that. It makes you feel like, in a very Stockholm syndrome way, like, you have a bond with the person doing that to you because they're sort of treating you like a quote unquote a professional, right? And that
yeah,
says a lot about what a quote unquote professional is
well,
supposed to be.
and and you've also got this thing where, on the one hand, this is not a secret. A lot of people in show business really are depraved in both harmless ways and harmful ways.
That's accurate. And I
Um, so
definitely
that's number one. And
experience.
then number two, on top of that, you have this whole power relationship
Yeah.
between producers and cast and crew on the one hand, and between directors and actors on the other, and on a third completely different hand, between actors at different levels of the
Yes.
power pyramid. So
Yeah.
you have all these interacting levels of hierarchy where things can go wrong in show business. And on top of that, you've got a sort of tendency for everyone to think everybody else is okay with everything anyway.
Yeah. And you know what? You're also trained to be comfortable touching each other's bodies,
Mm-hmm.
comfortable getting naked with each other in the same dressing room. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I had to do that since high school. I remember
Mm-hmm.
changing in the same dressing room as boys since high school. And that's, I mean, that could absolutely be problematic, but it's also, you know, it creates a mindset that my body is not entirely my property, right? My body is partially what I'm selling to you. This is how we were sort of told to think about marketing ourselves as actors. My body is my instrument is something that we would be saying. My body is my instrument. And if that means that somebody else has to play my instrument so that I can get paid, I mean, that is sort of a natural progression from that mindset.
It can be. And then on top of that, you have people who are very defensive about what they think of as decisions that they made, and maybe they feel that they weren't treated great and they couldn't talk to people. And
Hmm.
so, because they didn't have anybody to talk to, they get very vocal in nastily making fun of people who speak up now.
Yeah.
The things I remember, and I sort of get it, but it's like people like Helen Mirren and Catherine Deneuve, who were involved in a period of Hollywood, well, not even Hollywood so much, European cinema, where they were very invested in proving that they could be the same kind of depraved assholes men could be.
Yeah.
And I mean, this was a cultural thing at the time. It was a lot of, especially British men, but French and German actors too, were these just self-destructive prima donnas.
Mm.
And there was this movement in cinema where actresses were showing their maturity and their control of their careers by proving they too could be self-destructive prima donnas.
Yeah.
And during this period, it's some of these people who fought very hard for their right to, as they saw it, have the same vices as men. They were some of the people who were saying that when they felt like, well, women coming out and saying they don't like this sort of makes it harder for us. And it was very, very unkind. Like you're setting back our freedom by not enjoying your harassment, and it wasn't cool.
Interesting.
But it
interesting dynamic, because you like the movement right in the 90s for feminism, especially white feminism, right, is that we were trying to be men, sort of. We were trying to be at the top of the scale, right? So it doesn't exactly surprise me that there were a group of people that were doing the worst of what, I guess male rape culture is. But it does sicken me a little bit, because I think that nowadays, I mean, we really have to sort of shift focus from that, and I think it's hard for a lot of people to understand.
I want to go back to Palestine, but I'm going to say one more thing on the movies, because it reinforces how they treat people. If you've ever seen the movie Excalibur, directed by John Boorman, which is about King Arthur and his knights, and stars Nigel Terry, and the great Nicol Williamson, and Helen Mirren as Morgan Le Fay. Great movie, but Boorman cast Nicol Williamson and Helen Mirren on purpose, because they had been in a movie together before, and he knew they hated each other, and he wanted that they hate each other energy for the love story between Merlin and Morgan Le Fay. And so he did this on purpose, very deliberately, in a way that could be considered abusive to both of them.
Oh, yeah. That is not uncommon at all.
For the energy.
And if you don't mind, I could share one small, quick story about my life again. When so my bachelor's degree is in musical theater performance, and because clearly I'm a rockette. So there is my mother got sick with cancer and passed away my sophomore year of college. And my teachers, knowing this, on purpose gave me material to tap into that. You're supposed to be able to tap into your life experiences and use them for your acting. But considering that my mother's funeral was like 3 months before, I was like, I hadn't even yet processed all of my feelings about it, let alone like reliving that every day to play a stupid fucking scene for a class, not even an audience. You know what I'm saying? Like that is normal. That is normal. That is the job. You know what I'm saying? So that's something to keep in mind too, is that, and there's a lot of people coming out, like on TikTok, actually, a lot of kids who've graduated college and gotten into the acting world and realized how ridiculously, difficult it is to get a job at all, let alone one that won't exploit you. And they're coming out a lot about experiences they've had growing up that are exactly similar to what you're talking about and what I'm talking about. This is the culture, because yeah. So anyway, thanks for letting me share that. But let's definitely move on if you want to.
No. I'm really enjoying the conversation. It's just, and I realized that I got way down a rabbit hole, which I haven't all the time. I admit.
This is so Chris. Bess, welcome to Chris's show. You've been indoctrinated now. It's great though, because we start talking on one thing and then we look up like 10 minutes later and we're like, wait, how did we end up here again? I've been quiet because I have no experience in anything that you all were talking about. I'm a movie watcher. I have no clue about anything. I don't research movies enough to have any real basis. But I love to watch. I'm a watcher.
I love history, and because I love history, history is stories, and no place has more stories than Hollywood in very many different ways. So I've always been very interested in both the myth and deconstructing the myth and seeing the real history.
Thanks, honey.
Hollywood? Fuck Hollywood. I ain't talking about vaudeville. Go on.
Well, I mean, and it all trickles down. The attitude at summer stock in Abingdon, Virginia, is not necessarily different from the attitude at the movie studio. It's just the director at the movie studio has more power.
Yeah, no, actually, the history is that they recruited people from vaudeville to start Hollywood.
Yeah.
So it's the same.
I choose Abingdon, Virginia, because Gregory Peck used to do summer stock every year for years and years and years in Abingdon, Virginia, before he made it big. And so it's fresh in my head because I used to live near there.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. I had no idea. But yeah, let's definitely talk about Palestine if that's what you wanted to do next.
Well, I think it's good I think it's good to focus there right now, in the sense that, Joe Biden just started talking about a two-state solution again.
You guys talk for a second. I'm listening. I'm just going to mute myself for a minute. Go ahead.
Absolutely. And that really had me thinking, because, it doesn't matter what Joe Biden or Joe Scarborough or any talking head on television thinks about a two-state solution. It matters, well, will the Palestinians accept a two-state solution at this point in time?
But I feel like Israel killed the two-state solution when they semi-proposed it and then continued to impede on the land and kill people and steal property. And
I'm glad you mentioned that, because the guy who would most likely be running against Netanyahu for the so-called left and center, such as it is in the institutional politics of Israel, would be Yair Lapid. And Yair Lapid is the guy who says he's for a two-state solution, but his idea of a two-state solution is a completely demilitarized Palestinian state whose borders are completely under Israel's military control. So how is that different from the occupation?
Right, it's not. And so in New York on WBAI, the listener funded station, every Tuesday they have had, and there's a professor from the University of Massachusetts who I believe is Palestinian, and I apologize if this is incorrect information. And then there's another young lady who works for one of these international groups that have been watching what's happening. And their conversations always include this discussion as to whether or not a two-state solution is possible. And the answer is 100% every time. The two-state solution is not possible because when it was initially proposed, Israel killed it.
Yes.
And therefore, you cannot have a two-state solution in a place where it's already been
and let's be very,
it's not going to work.
Let's be very specific. When Yitzhak Rabin made a few very minor and cosmetic moves towards keeping Israel's side of bargains involving enforcing laws against illegal settlements, he got shot in the head.
Right.
And every prime minister since Yitzhak Rabin understands that if he gets serious about a real two-state solution, the settlers are going to shoot him in the head. And the simple fact is that the prime ministers of Israel are not willing to get shot in the head for peace.
Right. And it's also because it's a settler colonial state where
that too. But no, I just want to be clear, is that in order to make peace, you have to have somebody somebody on the bad side who's willing to die at the hands of the other bad guys in order to make peace with the good guys.
Right.
Now, this is Hollywood here, just to tie all this back together.
Right.
If you've seen any movie, there's always, if the end is peace, there's always some bad guy who's willing to die for the good guys to make peace.
Right. And Jared said Jared, can you clarify who they is when you say they never would have accepted it? because what they did not want to accept was a two-state solution in which they had no power, no control,
Yeah.
no
So,
ability to survive, and that's not a two-state solution.
Yeah.
That's the real problem is the initial suggestion of a two-state solution was not actually a two-state solution.
From the beginning.
Wait, so I'm so sorry to interrupt you guys, but I just wanted to mention I saw a great stream on Noli D's channel about sexual assault in the R&B business. So I just wanted to shout that out since we were talking about that earlier in the entertainment business. So I just wanted to give her a shout out real quick. But please,
thank you.
Yeah.
No, thank you for bringing that up.
Sorry.
Okay. So basically, where was I? Doesn't matter.
You were going to talk about the two-state solution.
Oh, yes.
I don't know if you were going back to when it was initially proposed.
So when the partition into a Jewish state and an Arab state was first decreed, and let's be important about this. It was decreed.
Mm-hmm.
The UN made all of these decisions without consulting the Palestinians.
Right.
Pretty much according to suggestions made by British ambassadors who were literally receiving the stuff from the leaders of the people who would eventually become the Israeli government, and saying, here, this is how we think our colony should be partitioned. And it was already such a partition is designed to isolate the Palestinians from each other in various ways, while the Israeli state controlled all the territory that the British had wanted to keep themselves in the first place when they screwed the Hashemites over. And for that history, to put it simply, during World War I, Britain was at war with the Ottoman Empire, which was ruled out of what's now Turkey. The Ottoman Empire included all of what we now call the Middle East, and it was all ruled out of Constantinople, in theory by a sultan. And in fact, it was the immediate area of Palestine and Syria and Turkey was controlled by a prime minister, with the provinces being more or less, depending on the province, autonomous to various degrees. Egypt was notoriously autonomous from the empire even before it was British, and other parts were very careful to listen to the empire, to the sultan. The sultan and the prime minister had a lot of control over who was in charge in Albania, which was the European frontier then. And so there's all this local politics that was going on from the beginning. And then in 1916, during World War I, in the context of the British war effort against the Ottoman Empire, the British supported what is now called the Great Arab Revolt. This is that Lawrence of Arabia movie, to tie back into Hollywood. For people who aren't familiar with this in any other way, this is Lawrence of Arabia. And what that consisted of was British diplomats and British army officers talking to the Sharif of Mecca, who was the great-grandfather, the great-grandfather of the current king of Jordan, to raise a revolution against the Ottoman Empire in the name of an Arab state. And the British promised the great-grandfather of the king of Jordan a single united Arab state from the modern Iranian-Iraqi border all the way to the modern Israeli-Egyptian border. So the great-grandfather of the king of Jordan was promised everything except a set of port cities in Palestine, which the British Navy wanted for purposes of the Mediterranean. That was the deal that the Hashemite royal family made with the British Empire in 1916. In 1917, you have the Balfour Declaration, which reserved even more of Palestine for the British themselves in violation of the agreement with the Sharif of Mecca, who was now the king of Hejaz, which was an Arabian kingdom in what's now Saudi Arabia that was centered on Mecca and Medina, and did not include the tip of the peninsula, Riyadh, or what we think of the Saudi territories. Those were in theory a British protectorate, and in fact were ruled by the founder of the royal Saudi family, who eventually fought a war against the Hashemites and drove them out of the Arabian Peninsula and up into Iraq and Jordan. And then there was more history after that. But so in 1917, the Balfour Declaration comes out that reserves all of Palestine for the British, and then says at the same time, and we are going to let European Jews settle there, just like the leaders of the Zionist organizations have been asking for years. The Hashemites did not like that because they wanted Palestine to be part of their kingdom. You have to remember that the founder of the Hashemite kingdom was the Sharif of Mecca. His original reason for being was a sort of quasi-political religious role where he was a combination king and imam with authority over the holy cities. And so he wanted to add Jerusalem to his kingdom because Jerusalem is the third holy city.
Yeah.
It was very important to him. He felt very personally betrayed by the British that they were keeping Jerusalem.
Okay.
And then in the 1920s, the Palestinian peasants movement started because the 1920s was the period during which a lot of Arabs in the what we would call the bourgeois classes were sort of soft Zionists, in that they were encouraging emigration. They were selling their land to Jewish settlers, and the peasants who did all the work on that land, because remember, we're talking about the landowning class in an aristocratic area that had been ruled as a province of an actual sultan within recent history. There was an aristocratic and hierarchical system already in place. These were noble families to a certain degree. One of their disagreements with the British was that they were not treated as peers of the realm. Because, hey, we're landowning noblemen. Why aren't we treated like the British barons? But so some of them were very much in the idea of bringing Jewish settlers to Palestine in order to improve the economy and modernize it and westernize it and build a modern Arab state, so to speak. But then in the 1920s, the peasants movement started because you have a landowning nobleman who owns the land but doesn't work it himself, right? So he has people who work it for him. In any sort of feudal situation, you have peasants. The feudal system doesn't work without peasants who actually do the work.
Right.
Now, the problem is that it wasn't a case of a Palestinian landowner selling the land to a settler landowner who was going to run it the way it was run before. They were selling it to a group of settlers who wanted to make a group settlement so that they could work the land themselves. What happens to the peasants in this scenario?
Yeah.
Now, so you have the landowning class of Palestinians selling land out from under the peasants to the settlers. And while the settlers themselves have a very democratic organization, the very democratic organization that they are pursuing leaves no place for the people who did the work in the hierarchical society, who are then pushed off into the cities where, because of the social prejudices of the time, they are considered dirty peasants from the country who aren't fit to have real jobs in the city.
Mm-hmm.
And so this created a social problem for the Palestinians that did not exist before the sale of Palestinian farmland to settlers. So now you have to deal with this problem of the peasants, and you have to deal with this problem of the peasants in a way that does not impoverish the Palestinian bourgeois providing social welfare for the peasants. Because, rich people never want to become poor, keeping poor people alive.
Right.
So with this in mind, you have a pro-peasant movement that also really doesn't want to take away the livelihood of the rich. Mm-hmm. And so because the pro-peasant movement doesn't want to take away the livelihood of the rich, the solution is y'all need to stop selling your land to the settlers. Mm-hmm. Which was interpreted by the settlers as being anti-Jewish specifically, whether it was or not, which only the Palestinians at the time know, and I'm not going to speculate for them the way that some people would have us. Mm-hmm. But basically, it's important to understand that a certain element of the Palestinian landowning class objected to the peasants being immiserated because that meant they had to take care of them. They advocated taking care of the peasants. They made a big deal about Palestine needing to take care of the peasants, but they also said an important part of this process was not selling any more land to stop making things worse for the peasants. Mm-hmm. Which eventually in the 1930s became the restriction on Jewish immigration by the British authorities, which pissed the settler movement off so much.
Okay.
But it's important to understand the historical stuff here. There was a very specific issue of Palestinian peasants losing their ability to work and support themselves and having to essentially go on charity in the cities because they had no other options. And the people who were doing all the charitable work were then demanding from the rest of the landlord class, stop selling your land. Mm-hmm. This was a key division in the local Palestinian politics for all of the 1920s between the stop selling your land faction, which was led by the first Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was apparently very sincerely concerned in a religious capacity, as befits someone who becomes the Grand Mufti, about the well-being of the peasants, but who also didn't want to impoverish the ruling class taking care of the peasants. Mm-hmm. And so his reaction was, first, number one, blame the selling of land to settlers, and number two, make no more settlers a national issue for Palestinians. Now, Palestine was ripe for a national movement at this time because, as part of the British betraying the Hashemites, King Faisal of Syria, who was the third son of the Sharif of Mecca, was defeated by the French, and the Syrian kingdom, which had been the focus of all the Palestinian national aspirations after the House of Saud threw the Hashemites out of the Arabian Peninsula, they lost. Syria was French now. So all the Palestinians who had been excited about the Hashemites in Syria now became interested in an independent Palestine instead. And that's where modern Palestinian nationalism started. Arab nationalism, interestingly, was always very, very closely centered on Palestine, and it was always the Palestinians who were most interested in an Arab state. And the Palestinians were very supportive of the Hashemites for that reason. And when the Hashemites lost in Syria, they became very interested in a Palestinian state for the same reason.
Okay.
And so no more settlers became an issue of Arab statehood to the leaders of the new Arab nationalist movement.
Right. And this was what, like right
1920s.
Okay.
The big point of inflection in what we would call the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was in 1920 or 1921, where what started as a Palestinian nationalist rally was allegedly stoned by revisionist Zionists in the audience, and the speeches rapidly became anti-Semitic in reaction. And then there were anti-Jewish riots in Jerusalem, which the leaders of the Jewish Agency presented to the British in the context of a pogrom. The leaders of the Jewish community in Palestine at this time were Russian Jews who had very close and intimate experience with pogroms themselves in their younger days.
Yeah, that's my heritage.
Who thought of all their interactions with governments in terms of pogroms and negotiating the response to pogroms, and didn't really have another frame of reference. And so they blamed the British authorities every time the Arabs did anything that they perceived as similar to what they would consider a pogrom in Russia. Now, a lot of this was Arab nationalist stuff that had nothing directly to do with Jewish people as Jews, and more to do with the character of the settler movement as settlers wanting to build a settler state in the midst of the place where the Arab nationalists wanted their Arab nation. Obviously, in any dispute like that, obviously you're going to get people who invest in it religiously. The revisionist Zionists were very aggressive about their interpretation of Judaism. And the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was very, very outspoken about his interpretation of Islam, though he was a nationalist and not a fundamentalist, and wanted a secular state in which people listened to him rather than something like Iran, where he had all the power at the end of the day. But he also ended up taking the only place that would give him shelter after he got run out by the British was Nazi Germany, and of course, nobody who rooms with Hitler comes out better for the experience.
No.
But what was he supposed? But you've got to ask the question: what was he supposed to do? He was the only place in the world that would give him shelter was Nazi Germany. What do we want him to do? He did not know what was going on, contrary to Bibi Netanyahu's story. He was not part of the inner circle. He was one of the many people that Hitler kept hanging around to feel important, but never actually did anything with or helped.
It sounds like, he was backed up against a wall.
I mean, it's one of those things. It's like the Ukrainian nationalists at the time, where initially they're like, well, we'll help Hitler and Hitler will give us a country. And then Hitler didn't give them a country, which they should have expected. And they declared their country. And then Hitler locked up their leaders in a concentration camp and said, you work for me now. And they worked for him. They thought they were making a great deal, and they ended up just being flunkies and pawns.
Yeah.
And the same thing, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem thought he was making a great deal, and he ended up basically under house arrest in Germany and not given much time so that Hitler could feel important.
Mm.
And of course, that lends itself now to Bibi Netanyahu being able to say things like, Hitler didn't want to do the Holocaust. This Palestinian guy told him to. That's the context for what Bibi Netanyahu is saying. Is the historical context for that statement by Bibi.
Okay.
So when Bibi says the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem told Hitler to do the Holocaust, the reason that was happening is because he was under house arrest in Germany because he was trying to get away from the British.
Right. Wow.
But it's the historical context that matters even more, because it's up to the Palestinians to decide what they're going to accept. And we have to understand the historical context in order to understand why it's their decision and not ours.
Right. 100%.
And when we talk about a two-state solution, if the Palestinians want to accept a two-state solution and choose to make that acquiescence, I would never say, no, don't do that. That's their decision. But that's their decision. And by that same reasoning, if they don't want to acquiesce, because let's be frank, a two-state solution is an acquiescence. If you live in a house, it's your house, and somebody comes into your house at gunpoint and moves you out of your bedroom into the basement, and then draws up a contract and says, hey, let's compromise. I don't want to fight. You can keep the basement and the rest of the house is mine. Is that a fair deal? Or are you already giving up most of your house to a guy who invaded your home with a gun?
Right.
So that by itself is already a huge, 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 huge acquiescence by Palestinians, should they choose to accept it.
Mm-hmm.
So when you add stuff on top of that, like the Palestinian state has to be demilitarized, they can't defend themselves, Israel has to control their borders.
Yeah.
I mean, how can you possibly blame anyone for saying no to that if that's what they decide to do?
Right.
Seriously.
Because it sounds like just an extension of what's going on already.
It's just a different.
I was going to say, it's not even an extension. It's just a different title for what they're already doing.
It's a different legal form for the status quo, and keeping everything the same and calling it a two-state solution and expecting the Palestinians to behave themselves and take it.
And to accept it, right. And this has always been, in every situation where you have colonialism, imperialism, empire, capitalism, greed, this is always the problem, right? Like, it's always the people who have access to the resources that they need to make demands of the people who have access to the resources that they want.
Yes.
Right?
Yes,
so
exactly.
If you have access to the military power and the guns and the military force and psychopaths who are willing to kill whoever you tell them to kill, then you feel confident in telling somebody else that they have to give up the things that actually belong to them simply because you want them, right? And it's
it's like prior to the arrival of European colonists in Western Africa, every slave system in history had been prisoners of war.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that's right. I'm not excusing slavery. I'm not apologizing for slavery in any way, but it was a change.
That is interesting.
Because the Roman slave system, the whole historical slave system was built on a basic fundamental idea that the king borrows money from the temple. The king invades his neighbor and takes his neighbor's city. The king takes the population of that city and sells them into slavery. And then the king puts his people in that city. Now, this was the way that war was carried out and ethnic cleansing was carried out on an institutional level over the course of history. City populations were enslaved and replaced and became the working class in the society that used to be theirs.
Well, it sounds like,
But
it sounds like it's the same under a different name, as we were saying before, though. Like,
it is up to a point, but
yeah.
there were, because this was a system where you were a prisoner of war,
Mm-hmm.
there were also these rules about it. And there were bad situations which were every bit as genocidal as 19th century chattel slavery. That's not a denial. You didn't want to work on a grain farm or in a mine. That was bad.
All right, but the baseline you're comparing this to is the Roman society.
Even every slave society in history before Europeans arrived in West Africa, not even just so much every human society before Europeans arrived in, specifically West Africa, had a system of slavery. But that West African system of slavery was based on prisoners taken in war being treated a certain way because they were prisoners.
Couldn't you argue that Europeans came to Africa in a war?
But here's the thing. They coerced the local government to expand their existing system and change it to accommodate them.
Okay.
So whereas before you had kingdoms that fought each other for all the reasons that kingdoms fought each other, and also made the prisoners slaves, you now had a system where clients of the Portuguese or the British were fighting wars with their neighbors in order to sell more slaves to the Portuguese or the British. That's a major cultural change, and it is a huge shift in the aims of the war that changes society as a result.
So in a way, it's almost like the industrialization of slave trading.
That's a really good way to look at it. There are stories in Nigeria, old stories about witches, where you join the secret society of witches, and in order to prove your loyalty, they make you secretly kill and eat every member of your family.
Oh yeah, I did that last Thursday.
But this society of witches, you become rich and powerful as a result of your sacrifice to this society of witches and doing what they want.
Really? That didn't work out for me at all.
But this is the thing.
Sorry.
You look at this. You're joining a society of witches and killing your friends and family. This is a metaphor for what the ruling class was doing in the form of these wars to sell more slaves to the Portuguese or the British or the Dutch. So it affects the whole society, and it leaves trauma on the society on this deep cultural level where they tell this story. And so, and then because you're taking something that was incidental to the process, and it becomes now the purpose for the entire society on a distorted and gruesome and deformed level. And it happened specifically because people were forced to accommodate power.
Yeah.
And this is what we call capitalism, folks. And in Palestine,
capitalism.
In Palestine, in a situation where almost all of the other countries of the world were at some point at least given the illusion of self-determination, Palestinian Arabs are the one group that has consistently been denied in all of their requests for self-determination or national aspirations. From the very beginning of those national aspirations, almost becoming reality in 1916.
Yeah, that is really important to understand. I mean, especially for all of the propaganda that's saying, Israel's the right to defend itself, and like relating back to that.
Does any country have a right to defend itself? I'm not talking about people. People have a right to defend themselves.
Right.
Societies have a right to exist and defend themselves. But what is a country, and does it have a right to exist and defend itself?
I mean, seeing the history of this and knowing that, it reflects history in other areas of the world as well.
Mm-hmm.
You can really see how, this is not about religion. This is not about, it these groups are formed in some ways arbitrarily, right? I mean, these
Well, so what
because
is
of power struggles at a certain time, right?
so,
And this struggle did not begin 5 seconds ago. This struggle was even before the formation of Israel. I think you're absolutely right in talking about that.
Two hard questions for you that you can't completely break apart from each other in the context of the conflict, and that is, what is a Palestinian and what is a Jew?
Yeah.
Now, a Palestinian is a person who lived in Palestine in 1920, or who descended from people who lived in Palestine in or before 1920 who went somewhere else. There is a diaspora among Palestinians the same way there is a diaspora among Jews.
Sure.
The Palestinians assumed a social position in the Ottoman Empire that was very close to the social position that Jews occupied in Europe, which is to say, dependent on the government, but occupying a relatively elite economic position in society relative to the peasantry that made them vulnerable to the power of the feudal state.
Mm-hmm.
So it was that same relationship between Palestinians and the Ottoman states that there was between Jews and the European states, this sort of symbiotic need and fear and resentment both ways that led to our modern anti-Semitism.
Yeah. And one could argue that, our approach, our meaning the Jews' approach, is to find a foothold now and, join up with the boot,
So, and here's the thing, and I'm sure you know this being Jewish, but it's never been monolithic.
No. I'm fully
the fun fact.
I think that it is
one of the
discuss the community in which that, because there are a lot of people over here that do support, fortunately, and have business ties with and grew up with and what have you, are the same community as Netanyahu's community.
Oh, and Netanyahu lived in Pennsylvania.
Oh my God! He probably grew up with people like my family.
This is
oh my God!
Netanyahu's father was a college professor at a university in Pennsylvania,
Scranton University.
I'd have to look up the university.
It's either Scranton University or UPenn or one of the big ones.
It's one of the it's one of the reasonably private and well-heeled ones. I know that it's not. It wasn't some state school. But I don't think it was a big one. I think it was some small private college that's a notch or two above Ivy League, but where rich kids send people who didn't qualify for Ivy League for some reason.
His father taught at Dropsy College.
Yes, that's the sort of place I mean. Thank you, Renee.
Okay, yeah, he lived in Philadelphia for a long time. I think he actually went to high school in Philadelphia, if I remember correctly.
The reason the reason that his brother went by Yoni was because the joke in Israeli politics in the Israeli army was that Bibi and his brothers were Americans. And as part of the hazing in their military service, they called his brother Johnny and they called him Ben. Which doesn't sound terrible because we're American. But it was really it was really very fundamentally formative for the Netanyahu kids in their time in the Israeli army.
Interesting.
Yoni is most famous for being played by Richard Dreyfuss in the TV movie about the Entebbe hostages.
I don't know that.
He was the Israeli officer in charge of the team that actually got the hostages off the plane.
Oh.
So if you really want to insult Bibi, you say, dude, your brother brought hostages back alive.
Oh, man. Yeah.
But with that, but that was the joke. They were called by American names in order to single them out as not Israeli during their time in the Israeli military. All of the brothers were, and I think that you have to remember that when you look at Bibi now.
Yeah, and that's actually that's an important indicator of
his whole choice to go by Bibi was to sound less American.
I'm sure it was. I mean, because here they encourage you. I grew up Jewish, but in a very like my parents were hippies. My mother pretty much rejected organized religion and was very spiritual and that sort of thing. But because of family politics, I was still sent to a reformed synagogue as a kid, right? So I went to Hebrew school. And so my point in saying this is that we were encouraged to adopt Hebrew names and refer to each other as those Hebrew names. We were taught Hebrew, obviously.
Well, that's why it's Hebrew school, right?
Yeah, right. But that's not the only thing you learned. It was definitely like,
I know. It was just like,
but it was
like they teach you catechism at Catholic school. That's one of the reasons it's Catholic school.
But and they teach you Latin, I guess.
Yes, they do.
But that's the point, right? Because Hebrew, yes, is associated with Judaism in a very fundamental way. Obviously, to read the Torah, you need to read Hebrew, but there is also a very serious connection between Jews here, how we're raised, and how we're raised to look at Israel. Because we are raised to look at Israel as the motherland. We are raised to look at Israel as somewhere that we will possibly eventually move, right? Like that's why the whole birthright program exists, because they're trying to get as many Jews over to Israel as
one of my favorite moments in history, it doesn't get talked about enough now. In 2013, 2014, 2015, I can't remember the exact year, Netanyahu went to Germany to give a speech to a German Jewish group. And he said, and remember, the only place in the world you're safe is Israel. No, I'm sorry, not a German Jewish group, a French Jewish group. My apologies.
Okay.
He went to France. He's speaking to a French Jewish group. He said, the only place you're safe in the world is Israel, and we will always be here for you when you need us.
Yes.
And the French Jewish group stood up and started singing La Marseillaise at him. Like in the scene from Casablanca, just all singing in French. And it was one of the real shameful, real embarrassing moments of Netanyahu's career that we should remember and remind people of, I think.
And so I'm going to jump in real quick because I do have to make sure I'm off at 12:30. But I'm glad we spun to this conversation about what's taught, right, as part of like what Bess grew up learning and being taught about Israel. Because as you both know, I got into a fight on Twitter yesterday with this moron who could not understand that what I was explaining to him was this idea that there are good Jews and bad Jews is nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
I already don't really like the whole good people, bad people thing, because I just feel like that divergence when there's so many, things in between.
Somebody said something that I think is really true, which is there are no good people.
Right. Like, it's just, I don't like the whole good people, bad people thing.
There are people.
Right. People are people, and people do good things and people do bad things. And it's never that simple.
Absolutely.
And my point to this person, so someone had shared a video of this man, I can only assume he was in the UK, screaming at protesters and saying, if you were in Gaza right now, you couldn't even speak, and this, that, and the other thing. And I shared it. And the only thing that I said was, I want Zionists to stop hiding behind Jewish people. And I really want to get to a point, and it's something that I even am working on, where I am very specific in using the term Zionist and Zionism, and not interchangeably using that term.
I've even been saying settler instead of Zionist,
right,
simply to be more clear.
And making sure that I don't,
because it's worth mentioning.
Right? And it's
there used to be something called cultural Zionism, which was the idea that Jews needed to know each other better and have a better cultural exchange about the things that they had in common.
Yes.
And it was good to visit. It was good to visit Palestine in order to speak to Jews who lived in Palestine. And it wasn't bad to move to Palestine. This was very different from political Zionism.
Right.
One of the people who cooperated most closely with the cultural Zionists was absolutely opposed to the idea of a Jewish state, and was really, really worried about the future if too many more, and he put it in racial terms, unfortunately, but if too many more of these European, Russian, and German Jews come to Palestine, then they're going to piss off the Arabs, and we're going to see real anti-Semitism that we've never seen before, because these Russians are going to make us look bad.
Can I say one thing real quick too? Because I know you got to go, Renee. But I'm really glad that you pointed that out. And I also, I think that it is that okay. So I think that we are very programmed in this country to support Zionism, and I definitely think. Oh, this is what it was. I'm sorry. I was like jogging my brain. I'm sorry. So, Jews in this country, especially the ones who have the microphone, the white Jews, are very keen to say like solidarity with Black people because the WASPs hate us too, right? Like I've heard that a lot growing up, and even now, right? To sort of say, hey, Jews aren't the bad guy here or whatever. But that sentiment comes from a Zionist perspective. It comes from the idea that that those moments in time when we were pushed out of a place can equal such a ginormous tragedy, that it would be comparable to centuries of slavery and oppression. So I just want to debunk that and just fucking say that that is encouraging Zionism. If you have that mindset that white Jews are just as oppressed as any other people of color in this country, you would be incorrect about that. You would be incorrect about that. I think.
Right. And I think what I was mostly frustrated by was I kept saying, you're missing my point. The minute that someone moves to making statements that support genocide in an effort to occupy indigenous lands for their purposes, you're no longer practicing Judaism, right? Like
Right.
you full-fledged moved on to being an occupier and a Zionist, and
Well,
and so and I'll have to look into, because that's interesting, Chris, what you said about the difference between cultural Zionism and political Zionism. Because I'll be honest, I didn't know that there was even that this cultural side of it existed. So it's something that I'd like to understand more about. But my point was, anyone, you just have to take a minute to listen to any Jewish person who speaks on what they're, what the actual religion teaches, right? Which is that Israel shouldn't even be a thing, right? And in doing that, that the minute someone says, I support Israel, or you have to let go of the hostages then, or whatever, that we've moved away from Judaism and moved to something else. So therefore, I'm not going to call that person Jewish. I'm not going to call them, I'm not going to put a religious belief onto colonialism, because it,
Yes.
although very often one leads to the other, in this particular case, what I have found is that people who truly practice Judaism and are simply people who want to live their life in that faith, they have no interest in taking part in this. Like
That's
they have no interest in this.
well,
So
that.
that was, I was just so frustrated by the, well,
well,
they're bad Jews conversation. And I was like, you're missing my point, because once you've gone to the whole Israeli thing and
yeah.
supporting Israeli thing, you're no longer practicing Judaism. So leave them alone. Like, stop. And then he called me a bitch and he got blocked, because I'm like, we're just not doing that thing. But it was just very frustrating to me. And I find that people are so lacking of the historical knowledge. And I don't know everything, but I've taken the
So,
time to at least
so
read some stuff.
this,
And
this just brings us back to education before you go. You
right,
remember how Republicans got really, really upset about the idea of even making American history slightly racially accurate
right,
with the CRT panic?
right,
So these same forces that have an interest in not teaching you the real truth of the civil rights movement, and that Frederick Douglass somehow was supportive of a slow and gradual reconstruction after the Civil War. Thank you, PragerU. Now, let me go ahead and debunk. I want to do this with Renee on camera. I know she has to go right now, but I have to say, to debunk that PragerU video, my favorite Frederick Douglass quote is still in his speech to the Boston Vigilance Committee about the Fugitive Slave Act. If we truly want to make the Fugitive Slave Act a dead letter, we will need to make a few dead kidnappers. This is not the Frederick Douglass that PragerU was showing kids in that cartoon. This is who
Definitely
Frederick
not.
Douglass was.
Right, right.
Renee, I know you've got to go.
I do, and I'm sorry to jump while you all are still talking, and especially after being late. But I pushed it as long as I could push
We
it.
love you. We're
Love you
glad to
both.
have
Yes,
you.
it was so good to be on with you. It's been a while. Sorry, I keep missing your streams on Twitter when you do them. I try, but it's adulting, man. Being
I
an
get
adult
it.
sucks.
It was great. No, let's do one. Let's do one. We'll schedule one for us. And
Sounds good. Sounds
or
good.
we'll
And Chris, I'll plan
down.
to see you in 2 more weeks, unless something crazy happens in life.
Yes, no, that should be right, because that's the week. Yeah, that's the week after the Thanksgiving break. So
Right.
if I'm taking time off, it's going to be the Sunday after Thanksgiving. So that makes sense. Cool.
All right. Sounds
So
good.
that works.
All right. Sounds good. Talk to you all. Have a good one.
See you, Renee.
Bye.
All right, no. So, and that, what I was going to say, the gentleman I was talking about was the mayor of the neighborhood in Jerusalem where the Torah Jews fly their Palestinian flags now. All the way back in 1914.
Okay.
So he was saying that, so the mayor of the same neighborhood where Jews protest on behalf of Palestinians now was saying he didn't want too many of these Russian settlers coming to Jerusalem and screw things up. And he specifically said to the leaders of the Jewish agency that they were dangerously flirting with certain of the European tropes they were complaining about, most notably professing loyalty to the Ottoman Empire when they really wanted to start their own country.
Oh, interesting.
And if you think about the way that the settler movement cynically exploits anti-Semitic tropes
Yeah.
of divided loyalty to claim that all Jews must support Israel because they're Jewish,
Right.
is one of the ways in which you can say that the settler movement is itself, if not anti-Semitic, then anti-Jewish in practical ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting that she said it like that. And I think, I think it makes a lot of sense because our Bible is your Bible. I mean,
Well, I have a
we're
Tanakh
living
around
off of
here
the same
somewhere,
principles
actually. Yeah,
here.
no, it's right here. So just because I like
You've got
to
to tell.
make sure.
Oh, there we go. Yes.
Hebrew English Tanakh.
Beautiful.
This is how I familiarized myself with somebody else's version of the story. I actually read it.
Cool.
So it's not 100% the same, and the differences are important.
Yes.
But that said, it's there. It's clear.
Yeah.
It's
in no chapter of any Bible on this planet does it justify genocide.
Well, yes. I mean, let's be honest. Be honest. Joshua, Judges, Exodus, they go hard on the justifying genocide. Numbers, they get punished for not genociding hard enough.
Okay, so you're telling me that that statement was absolutely wrong? Great.
Now, yes, no, that's what I'm saying. You got to remember now, me as a heretic Christian, it's important to understand that the Jewish and the Christian versions of the Exodus to Judges story are not greatly divergent, and that is part of the problem. It's why there's a Christian Zionist issue. And that is the part of the Bible that everybody who claims genocide is justified points to justify themselves.
Okay, so remind me what story you're specifically referring to.
So basically, the simple way to put it is God tells the Jews that they are supposed to kill the Canaanites and take Canaan.
Okay.
Now, that said, there are also all sorts of rules about the people they were supposed to accept anyway, despite the genocide, which was basically saying if any Canaanite wanted to be Israelite instead of Canaanite, then they were welcome.
Uh-huh.
And that's an important exception.
Uh-huh.
Because the historical justification for the genocide of Canaan, as I understand it from my reading of secular sources, is that the people who founded Judaism were Canaanites who were rebelling against the more unpleasant historical aspects of traditional polytheism in the Middle East, specifically human sacrifice, a polygamy that was very close to slavery, and a treatment of family that was very close to slavery.
Yeah.
And if you see Judaism, not even Judaism, if you see proto-Israelism as a social movement against the things characterized as the bad parts of Canaanite society in the Bible, and you see the genocide of the Canaanites by the Israelites as a metaphor for the the bettering and transformation of Canaanite culture, you can say this doesn't justify genocide. But that is not the interpretation being used by the revisionist Zionists.
Okay. So what I guess I would say to that is that since we are all, we right, like the Old Testament is supposed to be Judaism, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if Islam is based on Judaism, then how come the Islamic people would be considered Canaanites? Because technically,
here's where, and this is where, you see, that raises up. This goes to the question I was saying before: what is a Palestinian and what is a Jew?
right?
So, the Orthodox definition of a Jew, of course, is your mother was a Jew and her mother was a Jew, and going back far enough, her mother was a Jew.
Right.
And that's your blood quantum. That's race science. That's everybody's idea of ethno-nationalism these days.
Right.
It was in response to being put in a very specific position in European society.
Mm-hmm.
That position was precarious and abusive and frequently oppressive.
Mm-hmm.
But it was also a relatively elite position compared to the peasants in that same society.
Yes.
And one of the reasons that pogroms happened was because the peasants could see that the kings were treating these specific groups of Jews better than they were being treated. And the king allowed them to take that anger out on the Jews so they wouldn't take it out on the king.
Interesting. Okay. And
so
that makes a lot of sense.
This is the historical tension relief of a pogrom, which is step one. The king privileges the Jews in some way as Jews in return for their support for the state.
Okay.
Step one. Step two. Groups that would be opposed to the king for all sorts of other social justice reasons are able to say, and this is where anti-Semitism comes from. If you look at it at a direct material historical basis, look at these people the king is favoring more over us, who aren't even Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Why are they doing this to us and treating these Jews this way?
Mm-hmm.
And then they would go and they would do something horrible to Jewish people. And the king would say, don't worry, it's okay.
Right.
And so now you've got this abusive relationship whereby the king takes his protection away from the Jews in order to make poor Christians feel better about being oppressed by the king.
Okay.
And then puts the protections back in order to maintain what he gets from having the Jews act as financial middlemen for him.
Mm-hmm.
Because the important thing to understand is that the stereotypical Jewish moneylender was not a free agent, but a royal employee.
Ah. Well,
the stereotypic Jewish moneylender was, in theory, lending money for the king, and the king could reclaim this money at any time. And it was based on the fact that, what's the way to put it? It was against the rules for Christians to loan money for Christians at interest. And it was against the rules for Jews to loan money to Jews at interest. But there were no rules against Jews loaning money to Christians at interest or Christians loaning money to Jews at interest.
Okay, interesting.
So there were all these weird financial relationships between bankers that were dependent on Christians lending money to Jews so Jews could lend money to Christians so that Christians didn't have to lend money to Christians.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I had heard that stereotype comes from. Was that specific?
But he was a royal employee who served a social purpose for the king specifically and the aristocracy in general, but specifically the king, because every time the king needed money, he would extort it from the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Before Richard departed for the crusade, he did two things. First, he demanded that all the Jews in England pay him a tax to pay for the crusade. And second, to make sure that they paid up as quickly as possible, he renounced their royal protection so that there were pogroms all over England.
Hmm. Gotcha.
And this was fairly common, the pogroms that accompanied the Crusades, because the king temporarily pulled royal protection away from the Jews in order to extort more money from them to pay for the crusade.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the reasons. It's another material source for atrocities, is that the king was profiting from the atrocities.
Okay. Interesting. You know, and it also speaks to, I mean, like sort of looking at how this, you know, this everything sort of came about, right? Like how you know, like we can refer to Jews as Jews historically because, you know, it was both a community and a religion, and there was no separation. Whereas today, you know, like the problem is more complicated because there is that separation of culture and religion, and we need
and
to.
now you don't just have the Orthodox definition anymore. You also have conservative and Reform definitions, which are more informal. And you have the Israeli state legal definition, which is, while still a blood quantum, very different from the Orthodox version.
Really? Okay.
So and it's weird because it's like the reverse of a Jim Crow blood quantum. To be considered Jewish enough to emigrate to Israel, your grandfather on either side had to be Jewish.
Okay. Even though Judaism is
even though Orthodox Judaism, the blood quantum is determined by the mother,
right?
The I hate it when I can't talk. The Israeli legal blood quantum, I don't even think it's grandfather. Any one of your grandparents had to be Jewish. Any one of your four.
Yeah. So 1 drop of Jewish blood is exactly.
It's the 1 drop rule. Yes.
Yes.
1/8.
Exactly how the Nazis defined us.
Any one of your grandparents. 1/8. To the equivalent is to be to convert it directly to you have to be at least 1/8 to be Jewish, the same way you had to be at least that if you were at least 1/8 you weren't white.
Right.
That's an interesting decision.
Yes.
Why did they choose that?
To get more settlers over to Israel.
Yes, that's a big part of it, because a lot of the immigrants from Russia who came over in the 1990s only fit by the 1 grandparent rule.
Okay, wow.
And this was this is one of the reasons for discrimination against Jews of Russian origin by by English-speaking Jews of other origin. Because what's interesting is Israeli society segregates along both race and language. If you are a German Jew who speaks Yiddish, you are discriminated against. If you are a Russian Jew who speaks Russian, you are discriminated against. Wow. The ruling class speak both Hebrew and English. If you only speak Hebrew or you only speak English, you are discriminated against.
Wow.
So there's that level. And then there's if you're Arab, you're discriminated against even if you're Jewish. If you're Black, you're discriminated against even if you're Jewish.
Right. You're discriminated against for speaking Yiddish. Seriously?
Yes, because Yiddish is considered a cowardly and what's the other it's an assimilation language. Yiddish is German.
Right, yeah. Well, yeah.
Yiddish is
I
German
remember
with a Hebrew accent, basically.
my mother telling me that her mother and her father would have conversations. One of them speaks German and one of them spoke Yiddish, and they would have conversations with each other so the kids couldn't understand. And
Yes.
I guess that there's enough overlap. Yeah, that's
Yes.
crazy to me. I mean, especially because to me that's such a part of my heritage is
Well,
the
and
Yiddish language.
this was also one of the reasons for discrimination against Sephardi in Israel, because
Mm-hmm.
the Sephardi would generally have a not would generally have a language similar to Yiddish in that it was their local language with an accent.
Right.
There was a Spanish with a Hebrew accent. There
Mm-hmm.
was an Italian with a Hebrew accent. There was a French with a Hebrew accent.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
Yiddish is just the one that's survived in the largest number of speakers.
interesting. Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
but also if you look at it here too, I mean, that's interesting that's interesting to learn because if you look at it here too and
but most
know
importantly,
if it's about the people who got a chance to have access to the microphone, but when you think about Jews in this country, you absolutely identify Yiddish terms
of
with them.
course, but then the ruling class in Israel. Now, they aren't all members of this group. But
Okay.
when I say they speak Hebrew and English, it's because they want to identify culturally as members of this group.
Okay.
The ruling class in Israel is a group called the Sabra.
Say again. The Sabra.
Sabra, Sabra.
Okay.
So when you see, it's the
Like
the
the
brand of olives or whatever that you're
yeah.
supposed to boycott is called Sabra.
Holy crap! Oh my god. Okay, go
Now
on.
the reason that you're supposed the reason now what is now the word Sabra refers specifically to Jews from Eastern Europe who learned Hebrew and English as part of the political Zionist process that comes before the state of Israel. So
Mhm.
the Sabra are the descendants of the original Zionists,
Okay,
the original settlers.
got it.
Now, the ruling class of Israel is not completely Sabra, but there are a lot of Sabra in the group, and Hebrew and English are the ruling class languages because those Hebrew and English were the languages of the Jewish agency during the 1920s in British Palestine.
Okay. Okay.
The British had specifically the Zionist leadership of the 1910s had specifically learned English during World War I, knowing that the British would probably have Palestine after.
Okay.
How's that for an assimilation stereotype? Deliberately learning English before they take it.
Yeah. Well, that was also part of Britain's campaign to make English the new lingua franca, right?
Yes, also it was. It was.
Yeah. Oh my.
But so they spoke English so they could get along with the British authorities because the British authorities were always most comfortable with local authorities who spoke English. So
Mhm.
by making sure they spoke English, the leaders of the settler movement were able to make sure that they got more attention from the British authorities than the local Arab Jews who spoke French.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because the second language of educated people who didn't just speak Arabic or Turkish in the Ottoman Empire was French.
Sure.
The Turks and the Arabs didn't speak Arabic or Turkish to each other; they spoke French to each other.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, that well,
And
okay.
replacing French with English in Palestine was part of the new lingua franca. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Wow.
Whereas in Lebanon they still speak French if they speak a second language.
Okay.
because it was part of the French mandate.
Right. Interesting.
Because you remember, it was the French who defeated the Hashemites in Syria and took over Syria and Lebanon, in order to cover for the British taking Palestine and taking official control of Egypt, which had officially been Ottoman but unofficially British before.
Okay. Oh, there's a lot of parts here, buddy.
Well, imperialism is so complicated.
It really is. It really is.
But,
and
but
it's
that
history. But I'm so glad that you were able to, so succinctly put a lot of this history into focus for me today. I really appreciate.
But that's really the context when you hear people say things like, "Well, what? Why won't the Palestinians make peace?" It's like, under the historical context, it's not their responsibility to give things up to make peace.
Yeah.
Why would they?
Absolutely. And you're absolutely showing me that they literally never had the resources.
They never had the chance to say it. They never had their own say. The very first the very first agreement between the Arabs and the British had the secret clause that reserved Palestine for the British and opened it up for settlement.
Yeah.
And of course, reserving it for the British did not just mean Zionist settlement; it also meant British settlement.
Right.
Now, all those people, all those English-speaking, all those British Christians, they left when or before the British Mandate ended, for the most part.
When was that?
1947 is when the mandate ended.
Okay. So right before.
In 1948 is when the state was declared, after the 1947 guerrilla war.
Got it. Okay.
And then the state was declared in 48, and the outside Arab forces invaded. One group, the Arab Solidarity Army, in support of the Palestinian guerrillas, and the other group, King Abdullah of Transjordan, because he wanted to take over the Palestinian portions of Palestine and prevent them from being part of Israel at all. Now, it's important to understand that while he expressed support for the Arab Solidarity Army and worked in conjunction with them up to a point, King Abdullah was not interested in supporting Palestinian nationalism. He was interested in expanding the kingdom of Transjordan to the western side of the river.
Okay.
Which is where the modern West Bank comes from.
Right.
The modern West Bank is the territory that was taken over by King Abdullah during the 1948 war. And which was therefore part of the Kingdom of Jordan until the 1967 war.
Okay.
So when Israelis insultingly call Palestinians Jordanians, that's one of the things they're talking about.
Okay.
When they call Palestinians in Gaza Egyptians or Syrians, they talk about the fact that Gaza was part of Egypt before the 6-Day War. But the Palestinians were Palestinians in the 1920s, regardless of whose authority they were under in the 1950s.
Right. Right. You know, that's also, I think, making this a little confusing for people who aren't familiar with the history, aka me before this conversation. Is that there's no where, what country was Palestine, right? What country was Palestine? And you can't from this history, you can't really answer that. I mean, you can say that
Palestine was part of Greater Syria. So when people say what country was Palestine, Palestine was part of Greater Syria, which was the original dream of Arab nationalism that was betrayed by the British and killed by the French.
Right. So if I can just super simplify this for some of us, / me, it sounds like a state the size of New Jersey is being sort of passed around from the just this is a for instance, it's being passed around from government to government, right? Like it,
Well,
as if, you know, New
so
Jersey were a football that the US had and
well,
then the British had.
just
Right.
just in that Tanakh, you've got the Egyptians and Assyrians and Babylonians and Medes and Persians, right?
Right.
So, you know, that's just 4 right there. Now imagine after that, Macedonians,
Oh.
Romans,
Uh-huh.
then the Islamic Arab Caliphate,
Mm-hmm.
then the Persian Caliphate that was centered on Baghdad,
Okay.
then the Seljuk Turkish Empire and various rump Seljuk states that survived that Sultanate breaking up, and then the Ottoman Empire, and then the British.
Woo! That is a lot of football.
And then at that point, handed over to the settler movement to become Israel.
Right. Right.
So how do the people who live there feel, do you think?
Yeah, really. Christ. Oh my God.
Yes, he's a part of the problem.
Christ.
Yes, because so I'll give you a great example, the city of Haifa.
Okay.
Haifa was a historically Jewish city. That is true.
Okay.
However, Haifa was destroyed by Christian crusaders during the First Crusade.
Okay.
And
So
Haifa was still abandoned.
Hold on. First Crusade dating back to like
1000s.
What is it?
1000s.
1000s? Okay. Thank you.
So one of the leaders of the First Crusade was the oldest son of William the Conqueror.
Okay.
In England, in order to put this in name and place context as opposed to years.
Okay. So that's probably like mid to late 1000s.
Yes.
Thank you.
So with that in mind, that is when Jewish Haifa was destroyed by Christians.
Okay.
And that's important. Jewish Haifa was destroyed by Christians in the First Crusade.
Mm-hmm.
Haifa was not resettled significantly until the Ottoman Empire.
Okay.
And it was originally an entirely Arab town.
Okay.
When Theodore Herzl visited Haifa in the late 19th century and said, this is one of the places that we should settle,
Mm-hmm.
there were approximately 10,000 people in Haifa. Approximately 243 of them were Jewish.
Wow. Okay.
So this is what was historically a Jewish town before being destroyed by Christians in the First Crusade. And I want to say this again to reiterate it. It was destroyed by European Christians in the First Crusade.
Mm-hmm.
Not by Seljuk Turks, not by Muslims during the Caliphate, not by the Ottoman Empire. It was destroyed by Christian Europeans during the First Crusade.
Wow.
Again, Haifa was settled by Palestinian Arabs, to use the term, during the Ottoman period.
Mm-hmm.
There was a small Jewish population. The Jews who were there were Palestinian Arabs who were Jewish rather than Jews from somewhere else.
Okay.
There was a small community of educated Palestinian Jews who did the same things other educated Palestinians did,
Mm-hmm.
which was their role in the Ottoman Empire, whether they were Jewish or Muslim or Christian. At the time, the majority of Palestinian Arabs were Christian, though Islam was big in the nationalist movement.
Okay.
Christians were in general more willing to sell their land to Jews at the time.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Not completely. It wasn't completely like that. The two oldest families in Jerusalem that competed over political control of Jerusalem were both Muslim. One was anti-Zionist and one was pro-Zionist.
Hmm.
But they were both Arab Muslim families. They were the two. They traded back the mayor of Jerusalem for years.
Hmm.
The first Grand Mufti of Jerusalem came from the anti-Zionist family.
Cool. Sorry.
But so anyway, but that was the sort of division. And so in 1920, Haifa had grown to a city of 20,000 people, of whom 6,000 were Jewish, mostly settlers. But that's still 14,000 Palestinians.
Yeah.
And then in 1948, when the state of Israel was declared, there were just under 100,000 people in Haifa, and it was a 96% Jewish city.
Wow.
So that's between 1922 and 1948.
Wow. Yikes.
It is in this context, the ethnic cleansing of Haifa over a period of about 20 years.
Yeah.
That the opposition to Jewish settlement arose.
Mm-hmm. I would imagine.
No, but that's it. The historical context is important to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And the city of Haifa is an excellent example of the historical context in which Arab nationalist opposition to Zionism evolved.
Uh-huh.
Because originally the Arab nationalists supported the cultural Zionists as people who would make an Arab state more culturally and economically viable.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And it's also an interesting look too at, the origins of this conflict, right? Because we, have been saying like, well, it's been going on for 75 years, but no, technically this ethnic cleansing has been going on for even longer than that, it sounds like.
Yes. Haifa was ethnically cleansed by the so-called liberal Zionists of the Jewish Agency. Now, that was a process less of open genocide and more of what we would call gentrification, perhaps.
Right.
But gentrification is still ethnic cleansing.
Sure. Yeah.
And you have to understand this context of urban gentrification combined in which the gentrifiers were Jewish, combined with rural displacement of peasants into increasingly gentrified and Jewish cities. Yeah. Palestinian peasants.
Right. Yeah. So
and this is the specific historical context for the Arab-Israeli conflict.
So if you were to say, like, if we were to change the 75 years to a more accurate number, what would you put that number at?
So the conflict in the sense of the Arabs start to see Jewish settlers as enemies starts in the 1920s.
Okay.
That is where all the strains of anti-Zionism in Palestine that the modern settler movement refers to as anti-Semitic begin.
Okay.
In the 1920s.
Okay. So the real
now that said, you have to keep in mind that the founder of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl, was saying in the 1850s and 1860s and 1870s that they needed Great Britain or the Ottoman Empire to give them a colony and move the people who lived there away. then then the ethnic cleansing starts with the political Zionist process.
Okay.
Because there was always an intent, originally one step removed, there was always an intent to ethnically cleanse. It's just the original idea was that when the colonial power gave the Jews their own colony, that they would just, politely move whoever was already there so that the Jews wouldn't have to deal with the fallout.
Right. Politely in sarcastic quotes.
Well, you don't know about that. Herzl could assume it would be polite because he wasn't the one doing it.
Right.
I mean, so you have to allow the fantasy. If you're not the one doing it yourself, you can fantasize that it will be polite and no one will get hurt because it's not your responsibility. You can blame the British if it goes bad. You can blame the Ottoman Empire if it goes bad.
Yeah, that's a fair point too. So,
so that's the context you have to think about. That there was always a belief that the colonial power would help them replace people.
Yeah.
And there's another trope.
What?
Replacement.
Okay.
Replacement theory is a horrible trope here in the United States. Nobody should ever believe that Jews are bringing in immigrants to replace white Americans.
Mm-hmm.
That said, the settler movement did bring in immigrants to replace Palestinians.
True.
And so this is another place where you see how anti-Semitism is strengthened by the anti-Jewish actions of the settler movement.
Interesting.
Because you can look at this. We're right. Look at Palestine. This is what the Nazis say, and you've got to watch out for that.
Yeah. Yeah. There is an unfortunate sort of contingent of neo-Nazis supporting Palestine in this for
the good news is there is a dispute within the ranks of the right over this. Good.
There should fight. People supporting Israel too, right? There's also
there was a Twitter fight between Tucker Carlson and Ben Shapiro over Israel versus Palestine.
Definitely go into detail, but before you
Ben Shapiro is pro-Israel and Tucker Carlson is pro-Palestine.
Right. Wait, hold on a second. Before you do that, I just wanted to make a quick point that Theodore Herzl, back in the 1850s-ish, you said.
Yeah.
Yes, I want to make the point that what I was talking about earlier, with how our religion is steeped in Zionist language, it started with him, right? So we have 100.
Not just him, but he was the leader of political Zionism.
No. But that colored religious language going.
Yeah. Well, but what's funny
adopted in our synagogues, and we have 150 years.
This is also where the conflict between Orthodox Jews and Zionists starts, because Herzl was a secular Jew who was not religious, was not practicing, who moved in the very Christian upper class circles of Germany and Switzerland. He was not someone who was religious. The religious element starts with a man named Jabotinsky.
Okay.
Who was of Polish ethnicity and Russian subjection.
Okay.
He was an ethnically Polish Jew who was a subject of Russia. How's that for confusing?
Well, that's actually that's my history, but yeah.
No, I get you, but that's one more extra pass around there for you for Palestine, is that the founder of the revisionist movement was Russian but Polish and very religiously Jewish.
Right. Okay. So what time period is that?
Jabotinsky was around, was a contemporary of Herzl who was around during the early stuff.
Okay.
But his strain of revisionism really starts to get big in the 1920s, at the same time that the conflict between Arab nationalists and settler nationalists starts.
Got it.
And Jabotinsky's folks were very, very much involved in these conflicts and were very much the reason for these conflicts in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
Their ideological descendants would be the people who would start the Irgun and the Lehigh and would do the really bad shit.
Mm-hmm.
Which is not to say that Haganah didn't do bad shit, but these are the people who did the really bad shit. The stuff that David Ben-Gurion and Haganah would publicly disavow.
Okay.
The stuff that made Albert Einstein say, "Look, I was right. Don't listen to them."
Okay.
Because Albert Einstein was very anti-Zionist.
Was he? I definitely got.
Yes, he was an international socialist, and as an international socialist, he was against European nationalist projects.
Oh, I love that. I love that. I knew I loved him.
Albert Einstein was one of the prominent celebrity critics of the Deir Yassin massacre. One of the people whose strong criticism from the diaspora community caused the Jewish Agency and Haganah to disavow the Deir Yassin massacre and disavow Irgun and Lehigh and say, they're not with us. Which, of course, they could never completely do because you're still fighting on the same side against the Arabs.
Okay. I want to let you know that I do have to run.
This is where we should wrap because we're starting to get where we're over the 2 hours and we're just being indulgent now.
I'm having such a nice time with you.
I always love the conversation when this happens, but it is a good time to wrap up anyway.
Absolutely. But I would love to talk about the Shapiro versus what's his face, if you have a couple.
Tucker Carlson versus Ben Shapiro.
Oh my God. Everybody's what's his face to me. I can't with names.
Tucker Carlson is a good person whose name to pretend to forget. It'll hurt his feelings.
He looks like a thumb. So I just can't, I just see him as a thumb. I can't remember a name associated.
Well, his original thing was he was the young one in the bow tie. And now he's the extremely old-looking young one in the bow tie. He's clearly not young anymore, but isn't yet the elder statesman.
I think he's really just the embodiment of a nepo baby. But
yes, I mean Tucker Carlson is the openly reactionary nepo baby. All nepo babies are secretly reactionary, and you can see it when Matt Taibbi gets really, really snarky about the left and shows that his father was in fact an NBC News journalist, and he comes from an okay background himself and is not working class despite being a class reductionist. Funny how that works out.
Interesting.
But with all that in mind, I mean, yeah, the Tucker Carlson versus Ben Shapiro fight is interesting. Because you love to see divisions among the fascists, and divisions among the fascists right now fall into two camps. Do we think the Ukrainians or the Russians are fascist enough for us? And do we think the Israelis are fascist enough for us that we don't care that they're Jewish? Now, obviously, Ben Shapiro and other right-wing Jews tend to fall into the "we support Israel" camp.
Right.
And people who are not open in their embrace of anti-Semitism and pretend that they are not anti-Semitic and therefore pretend to tolerate right-wing Jews,
right,
they would support Ben Shapiro and Israel. Whereas Tucker Carlson does tend to draw the more openly anti-Semitic, they're going to replace us crowd.
Right. That makes sense. Because you have to, I sort of see Israel in general as part of the Jewish bid for whiteness in European society.
Well, again, that's implied strongly in Herzl's in political Zionism's notion that, well, they're going to move the locals somewhere else for us so we can go there and be happily white.
Right.
And in the revisionist Zionism, it's a lot more open because Jabotinsky said, we're not going to buy land. We're going to kill people and take it.
Not good.
And they said, we're not going to settle for traditional Palestine. We want the Transjordan Till.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you start seeing people showing the map with Netanyahu standing in front of it, where like the whole Middle East is Israel,
Mm-hmm.
that is Netanyahu acknowledging that he is his father's son. His father, while teaching at that school in Pennsylvania, Dropsy College, was expounding upon Jabotinsky to say not just Jordan, it was Jordan by that point, but also Egypt and Syria.
Oh boy.
And that's where you start to get Netanyahu's map of the whole Middle East looking like Israel.
Wow.
And so
fuck.
And it's really just horrible because this is the group that Nazis point to say they're right.
Yeah.
And they embrace it because their notion of, well, Jews are only really safe in Israel kind of depends on there being Nazis, doesn't it?
Right.
Can you, if you don't have Nazis, then Jews are safe outside Israel.
Right.
Let's be honest.
Yeah. So
you need Nazis for it to be true, for Jews to only be safe in Israel.
Wow. That is beyond fucked. That is a twisted mindset.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is where you get the cooperation between the German Zionist Union and the Nazi government to send 60,000 people to Germany during the 1930s. Now, keep in mind that this is during the period of strict quotas because the British authorities were trying to mandate low Jewish immigration to keep the Palestinian ruling class who was supporting the peasants happy.
Yeah.
So this is the period during which it was illegal for those 60,000 people to go to Palestine, and the Nazis were helping the German Zionist Union sneak them in violation of the law.
Okay.
And also, of course, the Palestinian border was closed to Germany because the British were at war with Germany starting in 1939, which is why it stopped.
Okay.
But from 33 to 39, 60,000 people emigrated from Nazi Germany to Palestine with the support of the Nazi government in violation of British law.
Wow.
And 100,000 during a slightly longer period from the Second Polish Republic. The Second Polish Republic, though we remember them as being invaded by Hitler, were also reactionary and anti-Semitic, and their right-wing party, which was in power when Hitler invaded, very much wanted Jews to go to Israel for the same reason that Hitler wanted Jews to go to Israel.
Wow.
And so in both places, the revisionist Zionist elements cooperated with the reactionary anti-Semites in order to help ethnically cleanse Jews from their home countries.
Wow. Wow.
Because, and the settler movement is both, number one, an assertion of Jewish whiteness over Palestinians, even Palestinians who, if you've seen the pictures, are as white as Jews.
Yeah.
Ahmed Tamimi looks like an Irish girl.
Yeah.
So to say that it's because the Palestinians are brown is actually erasing the truth of Palestine to a certain degree.
Yeah, that's
But
a good point.
the Palestinians are treated like brown people by the Jewish settlers and projected as brown people into Western society.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, like, on the one hand, this is the Jews' bid to Europeans to be a sort of white country, right?
Yes.
And on the
But it
other,
is a collaboration with white supremacists who want to get rid of non-white Jews.
exactly. So it's so in one way, it's the Jews are sort of the Jews that support this, the Jews that are Zionists, are trying to establish themselves as a world power, when in fact, those who support Zionism that are not Jewish are trying to segregate and
Also, and
ghettoize
here's
Jews.
where it gets gross. Here's where it gets gross. Let's talk about Christian Zionists in the United States. Do you know why John Hagee wants you to go to Israel?
I don't know who that is, but
Oh, you're so lucky. I know who he is. I'm sorry that I have to do this to you.
I'm sorry. Educate me.
John Hagee is a Christian pastor
Okay.
of the strain of Southern Baptist evangelicalism that is best personified by the KKK.
Gross.
Yes.
Okay.
John Hagee is a vocal supporter of Israel.
Uh-huh.
John Hagee has referred to Hitler as sent by God to drive the Jews to Israel.
Uh-huh.
Part of his plan,
Yikes.
because he's one of those Christian preachers for whom God always has a plan.
So really, we need to debunk the argument that you're only safe in Israel, because if everyone's trying to push you in Israel, that means they're trying to push you off the face of the planet,
Yes.
little by little.
So also, let's point out
Which is what
that
Israel is doing to the Palestinians, by the way, right?
Prior to the 1920s, there were almost, and I say almost because there's always exceptions. If people have been finding reasons to hate their neighbors for centuries, and we may always have to deal with that on some level, no matter how we reorganize society, until people get past that.
Yeah.
But with that said, prior to the displacement of Palestinian peasants in the 1920s, there was no particular hatred towards Jews as Jews in the Islamic world. There was a disdain for Jews and Christians as not Muslim.
Okay.
And Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians occupied second-class citizenship in Muslim society and not fully equal citizenship.
Mm.
However, that second-class citizenship came with religious rights and privileges that they were denied in Western Christian society.
Okay.
In Western Christian society, Jews were dependent on economic security for economic security on unofficial agreements with very untrustworthy kings.
Mm. Okay.
Whereas Jews and Christians were institutionally granted certain rights in Muslim society.
Mm-hmm.
This is why certain populations of Christians and Jews preferred Muslim rule to Christian rule during the Crusades.
Okay.
This is why there were atrocities carried out against Middle Eastern Jews and Middle Eastern Christians by European Christians during the Crusades.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
But there's all this other cultural and racial stuff that goes into it, and religious stuff.
Yeah. Like, I would love to do a part 2 with you on this, because you know so much about it, and it's putting together so many pieces for me.
The contextual history is really tremendously interesting.
Yeah, it is.
It's also tremendously sad and tragic and depressing.
That too.
But it's not tremendously complicated. The Middle East has been repeatedly fucked
Yeah.
by everyone who wanted to come in and take over.
Right. Well, I do have to run, unfortunately. I have another pre-Palestine space at 2:00 today. So if you guys could join me, I would love.
I'm going to rest my voice before I go back to work. I have to admit, you can hear me getting growly now.
Yeah, I do. But that's because you've been spewing so much knowledge. So thank you so much.
No, it's because I talk over guests too much.
No, it's fine. Listen, there is one thing about being Jewish, that I grew up talking over other people. Everybody.
That's true. That. I mean, I've seen that. I hate to. I was once on a phone call between this little old couple in either Brooklyn or Queens. Just to make the stereotype complete, it was definitely either Brooklyn or Queens.
I've lived in both, by the way.
There's this little, but picture the accent though, because the accent was the traditional Brooklyn or Queens accent.
What do you mean?
So this little old couple, while I was trying to help the little old lady get her iPad working, were just viciously yelling at each other. And I mean, not like people fighting, yelling at each other, raising their voices, but still having some limits. But like screaming, "You're so stupid, what's wrong with you?" or "Why do you never let me do anything, what's wrong with you?" at each other like in an old TV show.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was on the phone trying to help her with her iPad while they did this to each other.
That sounds like fun.
And by the end of the call, she's apologizing for how mean he is, and he's apologizing for how stupid she is. And I'm just like, you're both, why are you still married to each other?
Oh man, that's funny.
It's like, for one thing, he is a horrible person. I would not stay married to him.
Well, there's all kinds of people in this world. That's what my mother always said.
But it was that back and forth. Well, you never listened to me. Well, you're always so stupid. And I'm sitting here right in the middle trying to help her with her iPad.
Oh, yeah. Yikes.
So, no, I know what you mean.
All right.
No, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I learned a fuck ton today. This was awesome. And I'm serious. Let's do a part 2 sometime.
We should circle back with me and in the DMs, and we will get something booked.
Sounds good. Thank you.
And everybody else, thank you very much for joining us. This has been the Eclectic Radical. My guest is Bess Goden of the Millennial Splaining Program. Watch her on YouTube. Follow her on Twitter. Her handle is right here in the window.
That's right, at Millennial. Thank you so much. And
thank you, Bess.
Talk if you can on Twitter.
Awesome. Take care, everybody, and we'll tweet at you.
All right.